As the old year of 1940 drew to a close, on the eve of 1941, the air raid sirens sounded once more across the British Isles as the skies thundered with the roar of Adolf Hitler's Luftwaffe planes. Flying in droves towards London, they were to launch their most savage attack of the aerial war to date, as they continued with the Nazi campaign to crush and shatter British morale. While bombs rained relentlessly onto streets and buildings, soon the dark alleyways and crooked passageways of London were illuminated by a fire so vast that it would be dubbed as the Second Great Fire of London. Firefighters battled through the dense smoke-filled air, making desperate attempts to quell the blaze as the city was engulfed in flames. Meanwhile, far below, in shelters and in the underground stations, civilians cowered in fear, hoping and praying to survive yet another night of the Blitz. Since the summer of 1940, the people of Britain had suffered months of terrifying air attacks. While the death toll rose, it was tragically clear that more civilians than soldiers were falling victim to the ravages of war. By New Year's Day 1940, as the dust settled and friends and families began to pick their way through the rubble, it's hardly surprising that the British felt more alone than ever in the fight against the Axis. The year before, France had fallen to Nazi Germany. Much of Europe was now occupied by Hitler's henchmen, and while Mussolini's troops continued to fight the British and Commonwealth soldiers across the arid African deserts, the planes and U-boats of the Nazis reigned supreme over the Mediterranean and the Atlantic Ocean. Nevertheless, by 1941, the cracks would begin to show in the alliances that Adolf Hitler had forged. And while the bonds between those fighting for the Allies grew ever stronger, distrust would breed mistrust between those fighting alongside Nazi Germany. The Soviet Union was becoming ever more powerful, building up its armies and their military machine, while the balance of power between Hitler and the Russian leader Joseph Stalin began to shift. Consequently, an unexpected turn of events would have a dramatic impact on the outcome of the Second World War. So as the story of the conflict continues, on land, in the air and all at sea, we'll follow the action as it unfolds in the prelude to Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union. While across the Atlantic, President Roosevelt finally rallies support for the Allied cause, giving Britain a fighting chance to make an impact on the Nazi onslaught. By January 1941, most of continental Europe was occupied by the Axis. France had fallen to Germany in June 1940, despite all attempts to fight off the Nazi advance, with Holland, Belgium and Luxembourg also absorbed into Hitler's Third Reich. To the north, Denmark and Norway had been invaded in April 1940, while Finland had surrendered to the Soviet Union just 1 month earlier. Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, Poland, the country that Britain and France had declared war against Germany in order to defend, had been neatly carved up between Stalin and Hitler, and its inhabitants were now being subjected to the horrors of Nazi occupation. The only country unoccupied and still battling against the Axis was Great Britain, and fighting alongside the British troops were forces from all around the Commonwealth. From Australia and India to Canada, soldiers, minesweepers, pilots and sailors arrived to do their bit to help with the fight against the Nazis and their allies. People had also flooded into Britain from countries occupied by Hitler's axis of evil. Polish pilots had played a vital part in helping with the fight against the Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain in the summer of 1940, and Polish cryptographers had been providing crucial information to those working to break the Enigma codes at Bletchley Park. Further afield, those still living in occupied countries were forming resistance groups, sabotaging Nazi communications and gathering followers to continue fighting in small pockets around Europe. But even with support being mustered around the globe to fight Hitler and his allies, the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill was wary that vital supplies and resources were running low. The Battle of Britain had taken its toll, with many planes lost in the fighting, and many air bases and factories had been damaged by the Nazi attacks. There had also been significant losses of men and precious equipment in the spring of 1940 during the campaign to rescue the British Expeditionary Force, better known as the BEF, and other Allied troops from the French beaches of Dunkirk. The evacuation of Dunkirk, despite being a retreat, had been celebrated as enthusiastically by the Allies as if it had been a victory. Hitler may have won the day, but Allied morale received a huge boost, although as the troops were transported safely back to Britain, valuable tanks and weapons had been left behind in northern France. The war effort in Britain quickly gathered pace as people were working around the clock to reach production targets in the factories to manufacture desperately needed war supplies. This would be key if there was to be any hope of victory against Nazi Germany. And Winston Churchill now laid all his hopes on aid from America. The British Prime Minister had, for some time, been forging a strong relationship with the US President. And while the Luftwaffe and the RAF had been battling it out over Britain, Franklin D. Roosevelt had made a symbolic gesture by providing aid to the Allied cause in September 1940. In exchange for territory on British colonies, where land or naval bases could be established, 50 American destroyers were transferred to the Royal Navy. Despite America's neutral status, Churchill was delighted, seeing the move as a decidedly unneutral act. In his opinion, the Destroyers for Bases agreement marked the beginning of the Anglo-American alliance in World War II. In America, however, the general public were not wholeheartedly behind their president, and people were reluctant to back any plans that might result in their sons, brothers and husbands being sent into battle in Europe. Many were still haunted by memories of the First World War, where hundreds of thousands of American lives had been lost on the battlefields of France and out at sea. When the British went to war against Germany in 1914, few Americans had been willing to join the conflict. It took the threat of German naval attacks on US shipping and the tragic sinking of the Lusitania in 1915 to help sway the public mood in favour of intervention. Over 2 decades later, Adolf Hitler was all too aware of the danger of drawing America into war, and avoiding the mistakes of his predecessors, he was taking great care not to aggravate the neutral nation. But while almost half the population of America were determined to stay out of the European war, peacetime conscription was already drafting many men into the military, and fears began to grow that their boys would soon be sent overseas. President Roosevelt was swift to assure the Americans that this was not the case, declaring that The people of Europe who are defending themselves do not ask us to do their fighting. They ask us for the implements of war. However, he did warn that if Britain should fall, Hitler's Axis powers, having avowed their determination to dominate the world, would control Europe, Asia, Africa, Australia and the high seas, leaving all of America living at the point of a gun. President Roosevelt felt very strongly about the war raging far from American shores, and on January the 6th, 1941, he made a moving speech to Congress that has gone down in history as the Four Freedoms speech. In his own words, he stated that we look forward to a world founded upon four essential freedoms: the freedom of speech and expression everywhere in the world, the freedom of every person to worship God in his own way, the freedom from want, and the freedom from fear. This is a definite basis for a kind of world attainable in our time and generation. That kind of world is the very antithesis of the so-called new order of tyranny, which the dictators seek to create with the crash of a bomb. The speech had a profound impact on the American public and was immortalized in posters and later monuments. But while many Americans seemed to be warming towards the possibility of entering the war, for the British, as they continued to fight alone against Hitler and Mussolini, words were not enough. With bombs continuing to rain down on Britain's cities and ports, and troops now being deployed in Africa, the Prime Minister pleaded with the American President, "Give us the tools and we'll finish the job." Churchill was all too aware that the Allies would need far more than inspiring speeches to help defend British territory from falling into the hands of the Axis. By now, the United Kingdom had reached the stage where it was unable to pay for weapons, and fearing the British would surrender to Hitler, Roosevelt asked Congress for a law that would limit neither the amount nor the kind of aid he could send. It would be called the Lend-Lease Bill and would authorise Roosevelt to sell, transfer title to, exchange, lease and lend any defence article to any country whose defence the President deemed vital to the defence of the United States. Despite Roosevelt's hopes that the bill could be passed as soon as possible to help Great Britain, there was vehement opposition from the isolationists. In Chicago, an organisation called America First was gaining popularity, and its most famous spokesman, the famous aviator Charles Lindbergh, was determined that the country should stay out of the war. An array of famous faces had joined the group, including the world-renowned film director Walt Disney, the actress Lillian Gish, and Alice Roosevelt Longworth, the oldest daughter of Theodore Roosevelt. There were also politicians who supported the organisation, such as Senator Burton Wheeler, who did all he could to undermine the president, circulating charges that the president wished to give away the American Navy, enhance his powers and make war. With much of the American population nervous about the prospect of taking part in another world war, the accusations threatened to jeopardise the Lend-Lease Bill. This meant yet more delays in sending aid overseas. Roosevelt was furious, and as the Axis tightened its grip on Europe, his concerns grew that Hitler would launch his invasion of the British Isles very soon. Across the Atlantic, however, Adolf Hitler had other concerns. The Nazi leader was planning to send his stormtroopers in a direction that Roosevelt had not anticipated. Although back in August 1939, the German Foreign Minister Ribbentrop had signed a non-aggression pact with Russia's Minister Molotov, Hitler was now greedily surveying Soviet territory and waiting for the opportunity to crush Stalin and the Red Army. This course of action was not only motivated by the desire to win more land for the Third Reich, but to satisfy the Nazi dictator's own personal vendetta against communism. And despite the enormity of the task that lay ahead, Hitler was confident he could wage war not only on the west, but to the east. The Germans had been watching Russian activity carefully and had noted the inefficiency of the Soviet military compared to the Nazis who'd stormed across Western Europe with relative ease. In the Winter War of 1939 to 1940, great Russian armies had been wiped out by the numerically inferior Finns, and the disastrous campaign had convinced Hitler that as far as the Soviet Union was concerned, we have only to kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down. On December the 18th, 1940, the Nazi leader had issued the first Barbarossa directive, stating his intention to invade the Soviet Union by the spring of 1941. And to prepare for this ambitious plan, he had been busily securing a Balkan tier along the Russian southern flank. Hungary, Romania and Slovakia had all been pressured to sign up to Axis allegiance, just 2 months after Japan and Italy had signed the Tripartite Pact back in September 1940. Romania in particular was now a vital player in Hitler's schemes. Historically, Romania had been allied with Britain, fought on the side of the Entente against Germany during the First World War. The treaty Romania had signed with the Allies in 1916 had been greatly celebrated, but sadly things did not go according to plan for the Balkan state. Although the Romanian army at this stage was relatively large, with around 500,000 soldiers, the men had barely been trained and were led by inexperienced officers. By May 1918, with 250,000 soldiers dead or imprisoned, Romania was forced to sign the Treaty of Bucharest with the Central Powers, and the millions of tons of grain, as well as the oil the country was forced to provide, would keep Germany in the war, and the Entente battling for victory until the end of 1918. It was Romania's oil that was of special interest to Hitler, as well as the country's great strategic value, positioned on the southern border of the Soviet Union. Hitler was also confident of Romania's allegiance to the Axis. In September 1940, the King of Romania, Carol II, had been overthrown by the pro-German anti-Bolshevik regime of Prime Minister Marshal Ion Antonescu, who readily signed the Tripartite Pact on November the 23rd. German troops soon began swarming into the area, and the country would now become a valuable base for Hitler, while the Romanian dictator became one of his great allies. While the Nazis quietly and carefully strengthened their control of the Balkans, the Russian Foreign Minister, Molotov, was troubled by Germany's failure to uphold its end of the treaty made in 1939. While Russia had exported oil, grain and raw materials to Germany, as promised, Germany had only sent modern machinery and weapons to Moscow sporadically. Hostility was building, but while Molotov asked many awkward questions, Hitler managed to detract attention away from the ambitious Barbarossa scheme, and he convinced the Russians that the Nazi troops were being moved into Romania to keep them out of British air range. Distracting the Soviet Union would soon appear to be the least of Hitler's worries, however. The activities of his Italian ally Benito Mussolini threatened to undermine the plans for a spring offensive to the east and would eventually delay the attack for several months. Mussolini had grown jealous of his partner's success as Nazi troops seized territory from Poland to Norway. And when he heard that the Germans had occupied Romanian oil fields, he was furious. To Mussolini, this was an encroachment on southeastern Europe, an area Italy claimed as its exclusive sphere of influence. He too wanted to enjoy the spoils of war and extend Italian territory, just as his German ally had done. And if Hitler were to rule from the Atlantic to the Urals, he would rule the Mediterranean and all the lands that surrounded it. Against the advice of his chiefs of staff and without informing Germany, for he knew that Hitler would object, on October the 28th, 1940, Mussolini invaded Greece, and as the southern Balkan peninsula was thrown into turmoil, Hitler's quiet waiting area would soon become a battle zone. Invading the cradle of Western civilization would not be the easy task that Mussolini had hoped, however, and while the Greeks battled back courageously, by the third week of November, not one Italian soldier was left on Greek soil. Greek troops soon began pushing into Italian-occupied Albania, and high hopes of victory for the Italian Empire ended in utter humiliation for Mussolini. In January 1941, both sides had reached a stalemate, and while there was world admiration for the unyielding fighting spirit of the Greeks, Hitler was growing increasingly concerned that the Allies would come to their aid and move into Balkan territory. Such a move would spell disaster for the careful preparations of the invasion of the Soviet Union, and Hitler was well aware he may soon have to intervene in the disastrous Greek War himself. There were also other concerns to occupy the Axis, as Mussolini's troops were not only struggling in the Balkans, but further afield in Africa. When Italy had declared war on June the 10th, 1940, against Britain and France, the British position in North Africa seemed hopelessly outmatched. UK Army General Percival Wavell commanded 40,000 Dominion soldiers, caught between 200,000 Italian troops in Libya and 250 to the south in Ethiopia and Somaliland. The Axis hoped that with a successful campaign in North Africa, they could strike north to the oil of the Middle East, cutting off the rich oil fields from the Allies and increasing oil supplies for their own war machine. But when Marshal Rodolfo Graziani, on the Axis leader's orders, invaded Egypt in September 1940, the tides of war swiftly turned. Despite battles on the home front, Churchill had bravely sent troops to defend Egypt, and on December the 9th, 30,000 troops under Army General Richard O'Connor were sent to reclaim Sidi Barrani, 65 miles inside Egypt's border with Libya. By December the 15th, 1940, the Italian troops had been completely pushed back out of the country, and by 41, the enterprising O'Connor turned the large-scale raid into a full-scale invasion of Libya. While the Allies hoped that control of North Africa would be a step towards a second front against the Axis powers in Europe, Hitler and his generals had turned their attention to the Mediterranean Sea. The campaign in North Africa depended on supplies arriving across the Mediterranean, and if the Axis succeeded in blocking off these supply routes, it would be disastrous for the Allies. The Axis already controlled most of the ports along the North African coast. After the fall of France, they'd seized Morocco, Oran in Algeria, Tunis in Tunisia, and as yet the Italians still had control of Tripoli and Benghazi in Libya. All that was left to the Allies was the Suez Canal in Egypt and the precious islands of Gibraltar and Malta, which were of vital importance in ensuring Allied success. The Axis were well aware of their strategic importance, but Hitler had had many problems wrenching the islands from Allied grip. He relied on the Spanish dictator, Generalissimo Franco, to provide the land from where he could launch his attack, and while Franco remained unwilling to take sides in the war, for the time being, Gibraltar remained in British hands. Malta was even more crucial to the North African campaign, as it not only provided a useful stopping post for Allied convoys on their way from Britain, but the island's position between Sicily and North Africa was perfect to make attacks on Axis supply convoys destined for Africa. According to Churchill, Malta was the unsinkable aircraft carrier, and while German U-boats continued to attack British ships crossing the Atlantic Ocean, in the Mediterranean, the roles were reversed, as Allied ships and aircraft based on Malta were able to bombard the Italian convoys, supplying the army in North Africa. The Axis were well aware of how capturing Malta could influence the North African campaign, and regular bombardments of the island, as well as the growing number of submarine wolf packs prowling the seas, soon made Allied convoys to the island suicide runs. Though naval escorts were sent to accompany the ships, and even submarines attempted to get critical supplies to the island, it was a significant challenge to keep the island supplied. And when Mussolini requested Germany's help in subduing the island, matters were about to get a lot worse for civilians and military stationed on Malta. In January 1941, Air Marshal Göring had ordered the cream of the Luftwaffe to move down from Norway towards Sicily. As well as thousands of Luftwaffe personnel, warplanes arrived by the dozens in daily flights, and by January the 8th, there were 96 bombers on the island, within flying distance of Malta, and hundreds more on the way. The Nazi pilots arriving on Sicily would include Joachim Muckenberg, a young fighter ace who at just 21 years of age had received the highest award of bravery, the Iron Cross, for the many victories he'd claimed during the Battle of Britain. And with so many skilled Luftwaffe pilots gathering to the north, the risk to convoys heading to Malta had increased considerably. In early January, an Allied convoy carrying supplies and weapons from Gibraltar was on its way to Malta and Greece. Alongside it sailed a strong naval force of destroyers and the aircraft carrier Illustrious, an important target for the Axis. The Illustrious was the Royal Navy's lone aircraft carrier in the Mediterranean and had already caused considerable damage to the Italian fleet, launching a devastating attack at the port of Taranto in November 1940. Not surprisingly, the Italians and the Germans were keen to remove it from the field of conflict. Just after noon on January the 10th, German Air Marshal Hermann Göring's Luftwaffe made its Mediterranean debut as 43 Stukas attacked the convoy, diving in synchronized waves from different heights to confuse the ship's anti-aircraft fire. Highly skilled, the pilots of the Luftwaffe pressed home their attacks with no thoughts for their own safety. And as 500-kilo armor-piercing bombs screamed through the air, the effects on the ships below would be devastating. 7 direct hits were scored on the Illustrious, and the aircraft carrier, whose flight deck of fulmars and swordfish might have made the difference to which side dominated the Mediterranean, was all but destroyed. Malta was now virtually alone, and would suffer the worst bombardment of any country in the entire war. In fact, more bombs would fall on the tiny island than on London during the entire Blitz. Nevertheless, while the Axis could celebrate the destruction of the Illustrious, in Africa there was considerably less to rejoice. O'Connor was still plunging further into enemy territory, now heading for the port of Tobruk, and the Italians were swiftly losing ground in the north. Meanwhile, in East Africa, there was a British counter-offensive attacking Italian-held Eritrea from the Sudan. Mussolini's dreams of a new empire were disappearing rapidly. On January the 18th, 1941, he departed for Germany, dark-faced and nervous, to meet Hitler at his Berghof residence. In the beautiful surroundings of the Bavarian Alps, the two dictators had much to discuss. But while Mussolini was visibly concerned over the deteriorating situation in Africa, Adolf Hitler was adamant that the Italians keep fighting and hold their ground. Above all, the Nazi Führer feared that if the Allies defeated the Italian forces in Africa, the British troops would be free to make mischief elsewhere, and Greece, dangerously close to his precious Romanian oil fields, would be their next port of call. Tripoli could not fall, he told Mussolini, and as soon as possible he would send reinforcements from Germany to help defend Libya against O'Connor's advancing troops. But even as the Axis leaders discussed military strategies, British troops were building up forces around Tobruk. On the morning of January the 21st, under cover of darkness, a fierce assault was launched, and soon O'Connor's battalions had breached the line of defence. Hurling grenades and using tank and artillery fire, the British troops battered the Italians' platoons, fighting to defend the city. Within 24 hours, however, the city had been captured, and despite the insistence of Mussolini that surrender was not to be considered, the Italian troops had no choice but to lay down their arms. As the Western Desert Campaign continued, it seemed there was no stopping O'Connor's advance. By January the 30th, the Allies had seized Derna, 100 miles to the west of Tobruk. Then, by February the 7th, the retreating Italian 10th Army was cut off and destroyed during the Battle of Bedafon. As Libya's second largest city, Benghazi fell into Allied hands. The British captured 130,000 Italians, and the Italian 10th Army ceased to exist. The way to Tripoli and total elimination of Italian dominion in North Africa lay open. On February the 9th, as the remaining Italian forces retreated to El Aghila, General Graziani sent a message to Rome, pleading nervous exhaustion and begged Mussolini to relieve him of his duty. 2 days later, he departed for Italy, while the Allies were left to celebrate their achievements. Praising the incredible accomplishments of the Western Desert Force, the British Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden, paraphrased the words Churchill had used after the Battle of Britain and announced, "Never has so much been surrendered by so many to so few." In 2 months, O'Connor, who would be knighted for his achievements, had led his troops over 800 miles, destroying an entire Italian army of 10 divisions, and had lost only 500 men. Though the Western Desert Campaign had been a great success, back in Britain, the political situation was delicate. Churchill had much to consider, while Mussolini's war against Greece continued. Britain had signed a guarantee with Greece in April 1939, and while the Greeks were still fighting Italian troops, It was seen as politically unacceptable not to support an ally under threat. Failure to take action might discredit the British. With much depending on foreign support, Churchill felt that a token effort should be endeavoured. He agreed with Wavell, commander of the British troops in the Middle East, to move a significant proportion of O'Connor's 13th Corps from Libya to Greece in the southern Balkan peninsula. Wavell had been reluctant to prejudice the campaign in North Africa, but with the majority of Graziani's forces captured, he felt it was now safe to transfer some of the men. However, the decision would have devastating effects on those who were left behind to fight. Adolf Hitler had been paying close attention to the Allies' every move, and as O'Connor's forces were left considerably depleted, he saw the opportunity to strike. On February the 12th, the newly formed German Afrika Korps, fresh and ready for battle, were raced to the African desert to prevent the total collapse of the Italian forces. They had better equipment than Mussolini's army, and even more importantly, they had one of the greatest commanders in Germany to lead them, General Erwin Rommel. Rommel was a highly decorated officer in the First Great War and had already met Allied forces back in 1940, when he made a considerable impact on the success of the Nazi invasion of France. During battle, his panzers had pushed deeper and deeper into France, moving so swiftly that not even German high command knew their whereabouts, which is why they became known as the Ghost Division. By May 1940, Rommel had succeeded in taking 10,000 prisoners as he thundered across Allied terrain, losing only 36 of his own men. What's more, if he'd been given the opportunity, he would have captured many more of the British and French troops had they not been saved from the beaches of Dunkirk. It's no wonder then that Rommel's arrival in North Africa was cause for concern, and as German troops began to make their way towards the advanced position of the British at El Aghila from their base at Tripoli, O'Connor's fortunes were about to take a turn for the worse. Rommel would prove to be so skilled at desert warfare that he would become known as the Desert Fox. When, on February the 20th, German and British troops confronted each other for the first time in Africa, the Allies would soon find themselves retracing their footsteps, forced to retreat back towards Egypt. Meanwhile, in the Balkans, Hitler was preparing to protect his precious Romanian oil fields, and with the first British troops deployed for Greece, this was becoming a matter of urgency. His goal was now to ensure the Axis had complete control of southeastern Europe, and he began to pressurise those countries that had not already joined him to sign the Tripartite Pact. Any country that failed to comply would face the armies of the Third Reich. The Greek government, as well as the King of Greece, who had rejected a German offer of immunity, were now treading on dangerous ground and would soon face a war they would find difficult to win. When Bulgaria agreed to sign up to the Axis powers on March the 1st, within a day, German units were crossing the river Danube, so that air and ground forces could be deployed in the Bulgarian countryside, ready for an attack on its Greek neighbour. But Greece was not the only Balkan country to hold their ground against the Nazis. The Kingdom of Yugoslavia, which stretched from the Western Balkans to Central Europe, remained as yet undecided about its allegiance. The regent, Prince Paul of Yugoslavia, had hesitated about following the Romanian and Bulgarian example by joining the Tripartite Pact. He was being urged by Great Britain and the United States to resist German pressure and attack the Italians in Albania. Following the First World War, and the Treaty of Versailles, Yugoslavia had been a friend to the French and was an important presence when it came to maintaining peace in the Balkans. After the fall of France in 1940, however, Yugoslavia was alone, surrounded by countries that were part of the Axis powers. On March 4th, 1941, Prince Paul of Yugoslavia met Hitler and said that he would sign up to the Tripartite Pact on the proviso that his country was not asked to fight for the Axis and that German troops would not expect transit through Yugoslavia. Negotiations were destined to continue for weeks, but in the meantime, Yugoslavia's future looked uncertain. As the Axis cast their shadow across Europe and beyond, Adolf Hitler, as well as keeping the pressure on the Balkan states, was also staying in close contact with his Japanese allies. On March 5th, Hitler issued Directive Number 24, Cooperation with Japan, hoping to persuade the Asian Empire to take action in the Far East as soon as possible to further distract the British forces. Japan at this time was in the midst of a long and brutal war with China and had already used the weakened position of the Western empires to their advantage. In 1940, Tokyo officials pressured French Indochina to close some of the few routes left which were being used to transport valuable aid into China. That same year, they had also demanded that the British government close the Burma Road, which ran from the British-held territory of Burma to the Chinese city of Kunming. At the time, there had been uproar in the House of Commons when Prime Minister Winston Churchill had complied with the demands of the Japanese. But Britain had been in a vulnerable position and there was little else Churchill could have done. Some of Britain's most valuable colonies were in the Far East, including the island of Hong Kong, along with Singapore, which was considered by many to be the Gibraltar of the East. There was also Malaya to the north of Singapore, which was an important source of rubber. And of course, Burma itself, with the valuable port of Rangoon. By now, the Japanese were ready to venture a great deal further afield than China. And if they could snatch the outposts of the once mighty British Empire, not only would they have access to the vital resources themselves, it would also mean that supplies to British troops, already stretched to full capacity, would quickly run dry. For Winston Churchill, the threat to the Empire was extremely worrying. There were more immediate concerns far closer to home. As the Luftwaffe continued to bomb the British Isles, Churchill realised that the fight against Hitler and the Axis powers would be a long and bitter one. Britain had now been subject to regular attacks since September 1940, and there seemed little hope that the Luftwaffe would ever ease their bombardment. During January and February, there had been intense bombing raids all around the country, as Hitler had done all that he could to dampen the morale of the British people. But it would take more than the Blitz to defeat the British. Despite the bombs raining down from the German aircraft, the resolve of the nation remained firm. The royal family set an example to the rest of the country, when, in spite of the dangers, they refused to leave London. Even when Buckingham Palace was hit in early March, damaging the north side of the building, they remained in the city and continued to rally support for the battle against the Nazis, giving hope and comfort to their loyal subjects. As the Axis closed in on land, air and sea, and more troops left the country to be deployed around the globe, the British government worked hard to keep the Nazis at bay, and extreme measures were taken on the home front. the Minister for Labour and National Service, Ernest Bevin, made the radical decision to call up the nation's women to help with the war effort. And as the adult female population joined the workforce from March 1941 onwards, Britain was transformed with the implementation of a total war economy. By December, Bevin went a step further and ordered the conscription of women into the services. Though at first only single women aged between 20 to 30 were called up, by mid-1943, almost 90% of single women and 80% of married women were working in the factories, on the land or in the armed forces.
This morning on Rhythmic Records.
In the 1930s, a woman's place was in the home, while a man's place was to go out to work. But with the onset of war, traditional social roles in Britain would change dramatically. Though many women without families had jobs before the war, by 1941, mothers and single women alike were being called on to occupy what were considered men's jobs. Indeed, their immense contribution to the war effort would play a significant role in Britain's success against the Axis.
I myself would like to go in the services because it's the uniform that appeals.
As the spring of 1941 edged closer, there was a change in tactic in the Luftwaffe's bombing raids. Rather than targeting cities further inland, they followed orders from Hitler to focus on the ports along the coast of Britain. The change came as the successes of the German Navy in the Battle of the Atlantic began to wane, and U-boat losses mounted, in part due to the extra destroyers Roosevelt had sent from America back in 1940. Karl Dönitz, commander of the German Navy, turned to the Air Force for help and asked Hitler to change strategy so that the swarming planes of the Luftwaffe now headed for ports such as Plymouth, Bristol, Swansea and Belfast, with tragic consequences for their inhabitants. But while more and more people were killed in the Blitz, on March the 11th, 1941, Churchill was given the news he'd been anxiously waiting for. After months of debate and negotiations, President Roosevelt had finally won over Congress and signed the Lend-Lease Act. This meant that vast quantities of war supplies from the United States would soon begin arriving in Europe. Those who were fighting Nazi Germany were given real hope that the war could be won. Adolf Hitler realised that America's days for neutrality were coming to an end, although the United States had not yet made a declaration of war. Nevertheless, Hitler now had powerful allies, and his treaty with the Japanese would prove to be of great use. Spies from the country were already surveying the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. By the end of 1941, as relations deteriorated between Washington and Tokyo, the Japanese would launch a devastating attack, not only Pearl Harbor, but American bases around the Pacific, crippling their fleet for a time. In March 1941, however, Hitler had little time to contemplate the threat of American intervention, with decidedly more pressing matters to attend to in the Balkans. While mechanized German fighter forces were flooding into Bulgaria in preparation for the invasion of Greece, Hitler still awaited confirmation that Yugoslavia would side with the Nazis. The country's allegiance to Germany was crucial to Nazi success in the Balkans, as attacking Greece across the 25-mile-wide Bulgarian frontier would be a daunting task. On the other hand, if the Nazis were able to attack through Yugoslavia's Vardar River Valley as well, they would have more chance of success against Greek resistance. On March the 25th, the regent Prince Paul finally signed up to the Tripartite Pact. But there were thousands of Yugoslavs, including government and military officials, who were fervently anti-Nazi. The nation was anything but behind him. On March the 27th, a coup overthrew the pro-Axis government, and Prince Paul was replaced by 17-year-old King Peter II, who was godson to the British King and Queen. It was a bold act, but would bring a terrible fate to the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. And Hitler, barely able to believe the news, furiously announced, "Yugoslavia will be annihilated, for she has just renounced publicly the policy of understanding with the Axis." As the Nazi Führer now made the decision to go to war with not only Greece but also Yugoslavia, refugees from Belgium, Holland, Poland and Czechoslovakia who'd escaped into the country while the Axis swept across Europe now began to flee back across the Yugoslav borders. On the dawn of April the 6th, the Kingdom of Yugoslavia's worst fears were realised, as the planes of the Luftwaffe were loaded with bombs and set off to begin their intense bombardment of the capital, Belgrade. Thousands of people would be killed in what Hitler referred to as Operation Punishment. And meanwhile, to the south, as the German army thundered across the Greek border, Greece would be defeated within weeks. As the Balkans were engulfed in turmoil, far away to the north, the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin was keeping a close eye on affairs. He'd already been informed by foreign diplomats that Adolf Hitler was planning to invade Russia, but could not believe the Nazis would attempt to wage a war on the vast Red Army while still occupied with battles elsewhere. Nevertheless, by the early summer of 1941, Hitler's troops would be ready for the war against communism, and the Second World War would be taken in an entirely new direction, as allegiances changed and the Soviet Union joined with the Allies. For Hitler, the delay caused by the conflict in Greece and Yugoslavia would have dire consequences for Operation Barbarossa, and when the icy winds of the Russian winter took hold, the tides of victory would begin to turn in the Allies' favour at last.